I think people feel that politics has failed them because both parties have followed the same economic model, high migration, high energy costs, inflation, low productivity, and people feel that politics doesn't work for them anymore. I think the working class want to be listened to, and they're almost sneered at by Labour. They're called bigots or they're called divisive. It's actually protecting illegal migrants against the rights of British people. We want the reverse. We want legislation to protect us. We want a government to protect us against the effects of illegal migration. Until people feel that they are being rewarded for their work, that they are being prioritised, that they are not being looked down on, then I don't think any government will be long-lived.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest today, Laila Cunningham. Laila, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Brendan. Lovely to be here.
It's great to have you on. I'm following your campaigning work closely, so I'm very keen to talk to you about it. Some listeners will know that you are standing as the Reform candidate in the mayoral elections in London for 2028. A lot of us are keeping our fingers crossed for you. We want Sadiq out. So there's a lot I want to ask you about. We're in a risky position at the moment because politics might change dramatically in the next hour, never mind the next week, but we'll see how we go. I guess we'll kick off with the local elections and also the elections in Scotland and particularly in Wales, where the party that you represent, Reform, did fantastically well, swept aside Labour in lots of England, and now is basically in charge of huge swathes of England in terms of local councils. What did you make of those results? Were you surprised? What do you think it tells us about the temperature of the nation right now?
No, I wasn't surprised at all. I think people feel that politics has failed them because both parties have followed the same economic model, high migration, high energy costs, quantitative easing, inflation, low productivity, low house building. And people feel that politics doesn't work for them anymore. Everyone's working harder than they ever have. I mean, those of us and are getting less for it. And people are asking, where's the money going? My town isn't safer. My public services aren't better. My schools aren't better. And my towns are changing for the worst. So what exactly am I paying for and what am I working for? And that is a failure. That is a failure of the two parties. So I think they're willing to give us a chance.
Yeah, that's the sense I get when I speak to people, is that they often say, hold on, why am I spending so much money for the government and things seem to be getting worse? The local high street, local resources, everything just seems to be a bit dilapidated at the moment. I think that's very true. And do you think, I mean, Reform did particularly well in some working class areas, particularly in old Labour heartlands, in parts of England, and really did fantastically well in Wales, which is the birthplace in many ways of the Labour project historically. Do you see Reform as replacing Labour as a party of the working class, even though it might have broader appeal than that, of course? Do you think working class voters in particular are crying out for something a bit different?
I think the working class want to be listened to. Working people, they get up in the morning, they leave their family, they go and work, and as I said, they're not getting rewarded for their work. They're watching their towns change, and they're almost sneered at by Labour. They're called bigots or they're called divisive. I mean, I found it incredibly maddening to watch Keir Starmer's speech yesterday to say that his solution is EU at the heart of Britain, and a closer alignment with the EU. How about Britain at the heart of Britain? How about focusing on building those towns and centres and rebuilding Britain? And he says, oh, we're going to have a youth exchange program. How about building a country where our youth do not want to escape, where they have an opportunity here to buy a home, have a family? And I think that's what they've noticed, because I think everyone realizes now that, and listen, the Conservatives are guilty of it again. They treat growth as like a sort of government slogan, and they feel that growth comes from the government. Oh, we're putting 300 million here, 500 million here, but they don't recognize that growth actually comes from the freedom to grow. So, number one, the freedom to keep more of your money, but also it comes from the people, it comes from the risk takers and the grafters, and I feel that successive governments have spoken more about redistribution than they have about wealth creation. and wealth creation is almost seen as a bad thing. And I speak to small businesses, friends of mine own one, and they're drowning in regulation and compliance. And they're so focused on complying that they're not focused on growth. And I'm sure if you drew a graph between increasing regulation, you'll find that it correlates with decreasing growth. And I don't know why governments can't see that. Um, and so I think all these towns have been hollowed out from small businesses that have shut, high streets that have shut. As I said, people are working hard and not doing well. On top of that, you've had mass migration that suppressed wages massively because it's been low wage. You've had they put pressure on housing, pressure on public services, and then if anyone says, "Hang on, it's too much," Labour look down on them and go, "It's divisive what you're saying. It's racist what you're saying. You got to accept it." It's almost become illegitimate for them to just complain about immigration. So I think they just feel they're not listened to anymore. For me, like one of the reasons why I left the Tories, I wanted to be governed. My parents came here in the '60s, and I know it sounds corny, but this country gave them everything. They are patriots. I'm a patriot of this country, and I feel that we haven't had for me, a patriot asks one question: what's best for this country? Whereas I feel we've been run by, I hate the word globalist, but literally globalists whose first question is what makes us look good to other countries. And let's prioritize that. And they've chipped away at our sovereignty for global partnerships and globalization, which has been to the detriment of the people they were elected to serve. And for me, that Nigel is the only patriot. And I think that's what people are realizing. They want a government that puts them first.
If you're a regular listener to my podcast, I'm sure you will have loved my chat last week with the brilliant Rod Liddle. If you haven't heard it yet, then do please check it out. Even better, did you know that you can get a regular dose of Rod every single week? Every Saturday morning from 10 a.m., Rod takes over Times Radio for 3 hours of spiky conversation, humor, and opinion, always confronting topics head on with big questions to big name interviewees that don't give you the line you've heard everywhere else. And it's not all heavy lifting. You'll get music recommendations from leading artists and the weekly TV review that tells you exactly what to watch and what to avoid. So join Rod Liddle on Times Radio Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. on digital radio, on your smart speaker, or by downloading the free Times Radio app. My parents also came to this country in the early 1970s and were overjoyed by the opportunities that this country gave them, which they wouldn't have got in the very rural part of Ireland that they come from. They wouldn't have had any of those opportunities. But it's interesting you say that because I'm a child of immigrants, you're a child of immigrants, and I often find that it is sometimes immigrant heritage communities who are most worried today about out of control immigration. And that's a very interesting thing, I think. And I did want to ask you about the immigration question, because that is looming large in lots of voters' minds. They are worried about broken borders, they're worried about just the sense that things are out of control. Um, how much of an issue do you think that is for the public? And is reform determined to push ahead with this question, even though we all get defamed as racist when we talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I get told as Stella, because you're the daughter of immigrants, you're not allowed to care about immigration. And I think that the argument has been almost there's no nuance in the middle. So you have people think that reform and people on the right argue that they say, oh, you blame immigration on it, you blame everything on immigration, and then you have the left that say there's absolutely nothing wrong with immigration, right? But you have to recognize, for instance, the Blair administration inherited, I think, net migration of 50,000. By the time they left, it was 250,000. And that really because they didn't introduce any economic controls to people coming in from Europe, I think we're the only country that did that. They almost set the precedent for Brexit. They let in so much labor, cheap labor or labor that undercut the working class that they're supposed to represent. They didn't support them, and I think the trade unions actually wanted them to put some stops, but they didn't. And that undercut their very people that they were elected to serve. And I think that was a precipice to Brexit. And then the Labour Party had the audacity to campaign to remain. When they set the wheels in motion for Brexit. And so I think it, and not only that, they made it, as I said, illegitimate to even talk about the consequences of immigration. And let's face it, immigration, mass immigration, of obviously illegal immigration. I think I do think. Labour. I think all parties are trying have recognized that it's an issue. Only reform is willing to do what it takes. As I said, a patriot who doesn't care about global partnerships if they are not for the benefit of the country. But even mass low wage migration has suppressed wages in this country. We used to be on par with America 20 years ago. Wages have been stagnant since 2008, and no one wants to admit the massive amount of pressure that immigration brings on housing, public services, social cohesion, just a natural way of life. On one hand, I'm the daughter of immigrants, so I'm incredibly grateful for this country. Forever grateful. I'm so happy they chose England and not another country. So I come with gratitude, but I also come with realism to what it presents. And I hope that there's a nuance. For instance, we're not anti-immigration. What? We're not anti all immigrants. Of course not. Um, but being wanting controlled immigration, wanting immigration to benefit the country doesn't mean you're anti-immigrant.
Yeah.
You talk about the children of immigrants. I think the children, especially maybe not you from Ireland, but my parents came from a very, it was communist Egypt, and you couldn't get ahead. And so sometimes, they are so grateful because they know what could be. But
Yeah.
but we know, Brendan, what the Labour Party have done, and I've said this, is that they've almost divided immigrants or politics along ethnic and religious lines.
Mhm.
And then they go to every group, the Muslims, they tell them, "Oh, you know what? This country's oppressed you. It's Islamophobic." They go to the black community, this country is intrinsically racist. Only Labour's there for you. We're the only ones that are gonna defend you. And obviously this keeps people angry and engaged, and it keeps them divided. It keeps them divided in different tribes, all pitching for against each other. And it fosters hate for the country that gave them so much. And I think Reform's the only party that has a uniting message, and that uniting message is pride in our country. Pride in being why you came here in the first place, why Britain's great, everything it has to offer.
Yeah, it's, and then Labour has the gall to call other people divisive simply for raising critical points when, as you say, it's playing this kind of pork barrel politics of playing one community off another and playing the identity card. Um, I did want to ask you about the social cohesion aspect that you've just mentioned there, because you talk about the issue of wages and pressure on resources. I think that's very true. But people are especially willing to overlook the social impact of, especially illegal immigration, but also different forms of immigration. So if we look, for example, at the some horrific crimes that have been committed recently by young men who came here illegally from countries that are, let's just say, not as forward looking as our own in relation to women's rights and how to treat women. There's a real reluctance to talk about that quite serious problem that women and girls in particular face. I think it's quite heartening to see that there have been protests by some working class women and girls about this issue. But why do you think people are so reluctant to talk about that? Even feminists, for example, refuse to talk about it. Labour certainly does. I mean, it's not racist, is it, to talk about the social impact of problematic forms of immigration?
For me, any illegal migrant is a criminal and should be treated as such. But you have seen a correlation between the rise of sexual assaults amongst those nationalities that arrive on boats. It's undeniable. I mean, I had to prosecute someone who followed a woman on a bridge in London masturbating, and his excuse was, doesn't speak English, and his excuse was, I have a condition where my penis has to be out. But but it's a bit of a nuance. But what happens is they get free legal aid, and they commit these crimes, and they plead not guilty or guilty, and it goes to the Crown Court, and it takes years, and women are suffering. We have a rape epidemic in London, and only 6% end up in a charge. And illegal migration and the ECHR, which facilitates it, is no longer compatible with the safety of women and girls. It is just not compatible. The ECHR is meant to protect. It's actually protecting illegal migrants against the rights of British people. We want the reverse. We want legislation to protect us. We want a government to protect us against the effects of illegal migration. And we don't have that right now. The Labour Party talk a big game. Oh, we're going to do this. We're going to restrict until you make it a crime to illegally enter this country and you make it a bar to claim asylum. It's just going to keep on coming. and you have to do that by removing us from the ECHR and the refugee convention, because as you know, it says that you can't punish a refugee from the manner in which they land in your country. It is no longer compatible, the safety of women and girls, and I'd say men as well, you know. How many sleeper cells do we have here? I mean, if I was part of the Muslim Brotherhood or the IRGC or Russia, I wouldn't even bother coming with a visa. You'll never get it. Just rock up on a boat. We don't even know how many we have here.
Yeah, it is crazy. Not, the fact that hundreds of people arrive every week on small boats and we don't know who they are is just astonishing when you think,
And the fact that yeah, and the fact that we don't know who they
yeah,
are, right? That in itself is a massive risk, and any government that wants to keep us safe would take that into consideration and say, "Hang on, I don't know who this man is, right? I'm gonna keep him away from society, away from villages, communities." But no, we're gonna let him roam free. We're gonna put him in towns and villages, and you know what? We're gonna ask the British taxpayer to pay for it as well, and we're gonna tell them they're racist and bigots if they say anything about it. It beggars belief.
it really does. You mentioned there London. You mentioned that there's a real problem of rape crimes in London. I did want to ask you about London generally. You are going to be standing to be mayor, and that's exciting. And I'm sure it's quite an exhausting prospect as well for you in terms of campaigning. What's your current view of Sadiq's London? How bad do you think things have got right now?
I mean, listen, I grew up in London, born and raised, born and bred. And as I said, Labour, on the one hand, Labour's very good at dividing it up, as I said, you know, to the point that you're defined by your religion, your ethnicity now, as opposed to your personality. You know, when I get interviewed, and I think the press have fallen victim to it, and you know, I get interviewed by famous journalists, and they're like, "Oh, did you suffer racism when you were growing up in London because you were Muslim?" I said, "Absolutely not. Nobody cared. Nobody asked. You know, you're cool, you're cool. That's it." And, I wanna go back to that. I wanna go back to that kinda London. Um, there was a carefreeness to London. It wasn't a utopia, but I knew growing up in London that if there was a problem, I'd call the police, they'd investigate. I could run to a police station. Um, I had I not only relied on the police, but I had confidence that they would help me. And now that doesn't exist. People are not reporting crimes because they don't feel the police are going to investigate, and that is a real breakdown of the social contract. It's almost a given that your phone's going to get stolen at some point. You know, for me, there's no point in having civil freedom if you don't have public safety, and there is a freedom to feeling safe by the state. There's a freedom to whipping out your phone whenever you want. There's a freedom for me to have teenage kids and not trace them and follow them wherever they are on their phone, and there's a freedom for a woman to get out of a club and know that there's a police officer there because it's a crime hotspot, and I can get in to a taxi knowing that safely because that taxi's been vetted. I know that if I go on the tube at night, there's going to be a police officer there. That's a freedom that I expect the state to afford me, and that doesn't exist in London anymore. And it's not the London I grew up in, you know, so I wanna go to a united London. Also, I speak to London's become a city where if you grow up here, you love it, and when it comes time to buy a house, this city's not for you anymore. You know, we are like, "Sorry, it's too expensive for you. You go live outside London, but you know what? You're gonna pay for a refugee because we've got 15 London boroughs that have declared themselves sanctuary boroughs for refugees. You go live outside London, but you're gonna work really hard to pay for someone who's just arrived to live in your city." That is failure for me. You know, you get Sadiq Khan who sits there and boasts about how much environmental regulation they've put on building. I wanna boast about how many young people own a home. That will be my boast, and if I don't get more people owning a home, then I failed. You know, we have 8 million, like, I don't know how many acres, endless amount of acres that are owned by TfL that we're paying to upkeep, and we should be building on it, but we're not. You know, we have so much, and we're just not building, and it's not fair. It's not fair because the promise in modern Britain should be you work hard, you get rewarded. But as I said, it's not happening. And then they wanna punish you if you drive your car, but he won't stand up to the unions. So every so often you have a tube strike, you pay a fortune in Ubers or whatever, and he's like, "You know what, by the way, I'm gonna roll in a Range Rover with, like, a motorcade, and you mugs over there, you're gonna ride on a bike, and I don't want you to take your car anymore because I think you should cycle." It's
Yeah,
disdain.
yeah. It is disdain, and listening to you talk about London there, I do remember the London of the 80s and the 90s,
Yeah,
and it wasn't perfect, but it did feel very different to how it feels
I
now.
agree.
It did feel more of a sense of camaraderie, less divisiveness, more and a greater sense of safety, whether you were looking out for each other or you knew that the police were looking out for you at some point as well. That kind of those social bonds seem to have gone in London, and I think, Sadiq Khan is responsible for a lot of that and the culture that he oversees. His attitude to crime is poor, as you've just outlined there. Things are getting
We don't
worse in
have
many
visible
ways.
policing. In a
Yeah,
city of 9 million, we only have 2 24-hour counters open. He promised one in every borough in his manifesto. Police stations are closed. I've visited so many. This is what people want. We have machete fights in Knightsbridge. What kind of image is that for this fantastic city? And yet he looks you in the eye and he said, if you say that, you're Islamophobic. And what's his solution, by the way? He lobbied the government for a central body to control what we post online about crime. Did you see that? Because he says it's disinformation. That is a dictatorship. He doesn't even want us to say the truth. So he labels anyone that talks about crime in London as spreading disinformation. You couldn't make it up.
yeah. His response to criticism is to have censorship, essentially. That's what he's saying.
Or you can't stand that there's a Muslim mayor. You're Islamophobic. It really annoys them that there's a Muslim mayor. No, we don't care what religion you are. Do your job, and we'd be very happy with it.
If you have a question about British politics, Israel, Iran, or any of the other topics we've been discussing here on the Brendan O'Neill Show, then I would love to hear from you at my upcoming Q&A event. The Q&A will take place live over Zoom on Tuesday the 9th of June and is exclusive to Spike supporters. That means if you're already a supporter, you can sign up for your free ticket right now by clicking the link below. And if you're not yet a supporter, why not become one right now? Follow the link in the description and get yourself access to exclusive or discounted tickets to all our events, plus unlimited access to the Spiked website. I hope as many of you as possible will join me at the live Q&A next month, and I look forward to answering all your questions there. See you then. What do you think explains his dismissive attitude to these problems? Because, I mean, on the one hand, you've got these kind of low-level crimes, but serious crimes like phone snatching. Like I don't use my phone in public in London anymore, which is a real drag for me because I have to use my phone all the time. You have to kind of go into a shop to use your phone. Um, but then there's more serious issues like grooming gangs. He was very dismissive of the idea that London has grooming gangs. What do you think is behind that kind of attitude?
Well, the grooming gang things, I think, is a scandal waiting to be uncovered. He's categorically said they don't exist. We've seen reports from the BBC that they do. I've read victim reports from Oxford where girls were driven here and hundreds of men were waiting for them. They do exist. And, if I'm mayor, I will go up. I mean, I will go after because I don't just see the groomers are not are the beginning. They would obviously be prosecuted to the max. But any, I don't care who you are, if you covered it up, that is a crime. That is a failure of the first duty of government, and there has to be a reckoning in that sense. But you say serious. A rape is reported every hour. Only 6% end up in a charge. So 94% don't get a look in. I actually had a lady ring me and she said she was raped, and the police said we're not going to prosecute because you were smiling on the CCTV before you went up to his flat. So you have the Met that's acting like judge and jury. That is a trial matter. Because actually rape, because it happens normally without any witnesses, it comes down to the credibility of either party. It's not for the police to go on circumstantial evidence and shut down a case, but that's what you have right now, and there is no trust, and I think the reason why he dismisses it is because he doesn't wanna admit failure.
Yeah.
I think a lot of governments go after the easy stuff. It's easy to go after hate crime. You created a specialist unit. I was a prosecutor in London, and if I had, let's say, a common assault, right? You push someone. Because I was senior, I had the authority to to dismiss cases. But if that case had a racial element to it, I had to go to my senior um, line manager, and we took words so much more seriously than we took actions. And that's what he's so focused on identity politics. I remember, I think it was a few years back, and he put the most incredible Instagram post out. And he said, I want Londoners to recognize what a microaggression is. You should look this up." And he listed them. One microaggression, he said, was telling people, "Oh, you speak really good English." My mum would love someone to tell her that. Another microaggression is saying, "Oh, you have really nice hair," all these things that just divide us. And it's easy to focus on the little. It's divide and conquer. As I said, they split it all. He's told them, they don't like me because I'm Muslim. Goes to the Muslim community. We're an Islamophobic. I'm the only one that can stand up for you, and it keeps people motivated. It gets them
Yeah.
out to vote
Yeah. Well, the
because they
running
feel it's an
joke.
existential threat for them. If he's not around, this country's going to come after me.
Yeah, that is how it's presented. And, the running joke in London now is if you want the police to investigate your house being burgled, you have to tell them that you heard some transphobic comments while it was, and then they might finally pay attention. Layla, just a couple of really quick questions I want to ask you before I let you go. People call reform racist, which infuriates me because it obviously isn't. But there is a kind of a wing slightly further to the right. People call them ethno-nationalists, and I wanted to get your view on some of that because I know you've got flack from some of those people, and so does Reform get flack because Reform isn't a whites-only party. It is, as you were saying earlier, a party for people in Britain who want to be proud of Britain, which I think is a positive thing. What have you made of that kind of flag that you've got? Well, not just you, but Reform more broadly. This idea that it's spreading the net too widely. It should only be for real British people. How do you respond to that?
Well, then we just do a DNA test, right, for nationality. I mean, I've had those people that you mentioned put out a meme of me being pushed dead in a wheelbarrow and saying she's ready for deportation. So it's been quite nasty. Um, but it's not what we're about. As people always tell me, what does being British mean? And it means what's in your heart. My heart. When I travel and I land in Britain, that even if I went on the best holiday, if I land at the airport, and I know you probably get the same feeling, I'm like, oh, there's something. I'm home. Like this is, and it's loving this country, um, and that's all you want from people who come here. You want them to love this country and listen, you want them to contribute. I mean, in Dubai, why it's a success, there's only one type of visa. That's a work visa. When you no longer can support yourself, the country says, thank you very much, but you need to go back now. And I think that we have to go back to that. Immigration has to be a benefit to the country.
Yeah, I think most people would agree with that. Okay, Layla, my last question for you is just about, I mean, who knows the answer to this, but because things are changing rapidly. But in relation to Starmer potentially stepping down, Wes Streeting or Angela Rayner or some other non-entity, if in my view, taking his place. I mean, is this government a busted flush? Do you think it can last much? How do you see that going in terms of national politics?
I really don't think it's a leader issue. I think the ideology is the same. As I said, we've had and conservatives weren't different. It's it's money printing to the max, which is inflationary and causes our money to have less value. It's high energy costs, it's mass migration, it's lack of building. There's so much regulation. We've regulated basically growth out of the economy. And they want even more regulation. They want closer alignment with the EU, which is like their dogma is regulation. And they believe that growth is a government slogan. That's it, and they don't almost trust the people to give them the freedom to grow, to create growth. So as I said, I don't as until people feel that they are being rewarded for their work, that they are being prioritized, that they are not being looked down on, by a government, then I don't think any government will be long lived in this day and age. And that's why people recognize that reform is that we are there to serve. We're not there to serve a party. Never. And you really do see them serving a party, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he couldn't even cut the welfare bill, which he knew was killing us. So I don't believe the leadership. I mean, if Angela Rayner's the leader, perhaps it will be a bit more fun to watch PMQs. People don't really care about the leader. They care about what's happening to them personally, and personally, I don't see an uplift.
Layla, thank you very much.